Hey folks, my name is Mo Amir and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show. Now, if you've been watching all season, you know that we do things differently around here. We ride in the headwinds of convention and we make no apologies for being interesting. And I promise you tonight is going to be very interesting. We're joined by two folks, both of whom want BC Premier David Eby's office, and they will have their shot by October 2024 at the latest. No strangers to the program, no strangers to each other. They are BC United leader Kevin Falcon and BC Greens leader Sonia Furstenau. Kevin, Sonia, thank you so much for doing this.
Delighted.
Thanks for having us.
So nice to see you. Kevin, let's start with you. And Sonia, I'm going to pitch the same question to you. Premier Eby has been premier for about 7 months now. So in your mind, give me the elevator pitch of what he has done and his government has done that you would consider to be a failure. And I'm not talking about Minister Eby or Attorney General Eby. I'm not talking about anything done under Premier John Horgan, something that Premier Eby has done that you would consider to be harmful or just not to the benefit of British Columbians.
Sure. Well, I think it would continue on a theme that I've always said, which I think it's really important that the public hold politicians, all of us, frankly, accountable for the results we're getting. And what we're not getting are good results. Doesn't matter whether it's healthcare or housing or crime or drug outcomes, we're just not getting good outcomes. And if I had to specifically hold them accountable for one thing, I would say it has to do with the reckless decriminalization policy that they've gone forward with, because the guardrails weren't in place to look after some of the obvious implications. One, making sure that we've got treatment and recovery facilities available for those that need that treatment and recovery when needed. Secondly, to make sure that we've got the education for kids so that kids don't get a confused message that decriminalization means legalization and that somehow drugs are safe. And the third is that, making sure that we don't have open drug use in our parks, playgrounds, and beaches. And I think that that is an area that increasingly you're seeing municipalities, most recently Port Coquitlam, all coming on board and saying, we're going to pass our own bylaws if the province isn't going to look after our own interests. Children and families are concerned about that.
Sonia, something that's attributable to the Premier himself, what would you say?
I think it's really important that we recognize we have these intersecting crises. We have a housing crisis, a healthcare crisis. We have a growing climate change crisis, and that's global. Mm-hmm. And what I think we need more of from this government and from governments in general is to look at the horizon and to start to look at solutions that actually solve more than one thing at a time. And so what we get—
a holistic approach? Come on.
I often say that the seriousness of the times that we're in, mm-hmm.
–
and what people are experiencing in their lives, not being able to afford a place to live, not being able to access healthcare, and as we see the mm-hmm. ongoing effects of climate change, the evacuations that have already happened this summer because of the wildfires, mm-hmm. we need that seriousness to be matched in our politics and our governance. And a lot of what I try to do, and this is part of it, is we need to sit down and listen to each other, talk with each other, talk about the solutions that each party brings forward. We represent collectively everybody in British Columbia. And so we should be able to work on looking at that horizon and saying, how do we solve more than one problem at a time? When we're talking about mental health and addictions, Kevin, you focus very much on one aspect. I look at the whole spectrum, the lack of access to mental health for kids in schools, the lack of access for people in communities, the lack of a voluntary care and treatment program in this province that people have access to. So we have to be looking at the big picture.
And we'll definitely get into that file a little more mm-hmm. specifically in a little bit. But Sonia, touching on what you're saying in terms of the approach, last year, you basically sat through two major changes in the BC Legislature. There was a new official opposition leader in Kevin Falcon, and there was a new premier in David Eby. So I'm curious, in that time, has anything changed in the BC Legislature? Because I feel like when we talk mm-hmm. about overlapping crises, British Columbians will go, hey, it starts in Victoria. So I'm curious, has anything changed?
I would say it has gotten a little more aggressive, a little more hostile in that time, certainly in the kind of theatrical pieces of the legislature in question period in particular. We now have a working group to look at legislative culture. as a result of Melanie Mark's resignation and the speech that she gave. After that speech, I wrote to both of the other leaders and said, actually, I think we need to start this from a leadership place. That culture of this place follows leadership. And as leaders, I'd like us to sit down at a table and talk about what role we play in shaping the culture of the legislature, of politics in BC. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I'm currently on that working group with Eleanor Sturko from the BC United and Mabel Elmore from BC NDP. But I still stand by it. We need leadership at the table to have this conversation.
So Kevin, let me throw this at you. I know we all heard what Melanie Mark said when she was leaving office, talked about it being a toxic work environment. Even your own MLA, Eleanor Sturko, has kind of brought up her negative experiences in the BC legislature. All of this seems to echo things that former BC Premier Christy Clark had said when she called Victoria a sick place. I'm curious from your perspective, why do we only hear this from women, and why aren't there more men speaking out against against the problems in the BC legislature?
Well, I actually think that it's because women probably feel it the worst, to be honest with you. And it's not, frankly, just the legislature, it's the whole social media environment. I've said publicly a number of times that I want to see legislation brought forward that allows us to strip the anonymity from people out there in social media that attack women and say very derogatory, degrading things towards women in public life. I mean, they shouldn't be saying it to anyone. But the fact that they single out a lot of women in leadership roles, not just in, as politicians, but journalists and others, I think is appalling. And I think we need to expose those people to the transparency and sunlight of, public discourse, and then see how brave they are to say those kind of things, when they know it's going to have ramifications for their employment or their family or what have you. So I do think that is a big issue. But look, our parliamentary system is 1,000 years of a requirement that we have to oppose. Our job as leader, my job as leader of the official opposition, is to oppose government policy. And I think the key is to not make it personal, but to oppose the decisions that they're making and to try and get them to change direction when those decisions are wrong, whether it's $1 billion that they wanted to spend on a museum in Victoria, or whether it's, trying to strip away individualized funding for parents with autistic kids. Like we all and often work together on that. In fact, Sonia and her party was, we unite together on things like that to say, no, this is wrong. Like you have to rethink this. And in those cases, we did get them to actually pause and to at least take a second look at the direction they were going in.
I can definitely appreciate that role that you play. You've both touched on the drug debts and the toxic drug supply crisis. We're going to talk about that after the commercial break. Folks, stick around because after some business, last week I talked to Premier David Eby about involuntary care, safe supply, and what he was doing differently to address BC's years-long toxic drug supply crisis that results in the deaths of 7 British Columbians per day. I'm sure our guests tonight have some thoughts on the Premier's approach, and we'll talk about it up next. Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. We're here tonight with 2 folks vying to be the next Premier of British Columbia, BC Greens leader Sonia Furstenau and BC United leader Kevin Falcon. And this conversation is supported by Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey, distinctly Vancouver Island, uniquely Shelter Point. Thanks for sticking around. Kevin, I want to start with you. Last week, BC Premier David Eby was on the program, and I talked about him, what he was doing differently when it comes to the drug deaths that we're experiencing here in British Columbia. And he said that, well, nurse practitioners and doctors have the ability to basically sign documentation that would commit folks into involuntary care if they were admitted in hospitals for multiple overdoses. He also noted that with Providence Health, they're starting a pilot project linking hospitals to treatment. And then he also mentioned $1 billion program that has already started to spend some of that money, which is really focused on recovery and treatment. This sounds like it's lifted right from your playbook and the playbook of BC United. So you must be thrilled, right, that he's taking your policy ideas.
Well, look, when we announced our Better as Possible, a mental health and addiction plan, it's something I'm very, very proud of. It was based on my own personal experiences, both as a former health minister, but also the 10 years I spent on the board of the Street to Home Foundation, looking, at the issues of homelessness and the intersection, as Sonia correctly pointed out, between mental health and addictions. And the one thing I'm absolutely convinced about is the approach we're taking in government is not going to get the results we need. And every year we've seen since 2016, sadly, tragically, the overdose death rate number has gone up every year to new historic levels. So the question is, if we do more of the same, are we going to get different results? I would argue, no, we're not. And the announcement that the Premier made followed the announcement we made on our mental health and addiction. And my problem is that every time they find themselves in a difficult position, they go and make announcements. But what we have to focus on is not their announcements and news releases, but what results are we getting? Now, I'm happy that they're going to spend more money. The problem is, I'm very concerned, as I always am, about their ability to execute and get the results that we need. What we've said is that we need to expand the treatment of those struggling with severe mental health issues, because we have to just accept, as compassionate individuals, we cannot allow folks to be left on the streets to their own devices, to be exploited by drug dealers and sometimes human traffickers. But nurse
practitioners and doctors can do that. So is there an expansion of involuntary care that you would like in terms of? Okay.
There is. And what I've said is that we would take the red fish model out at Riverview. We would triple the size of it. That started under the BC Liberals. We would triple the size of it and then allow people to be able to stay there longer. A lot of the top psychiatrists in the province tell me that 8 to 9 months, which is typically the maximum stay there, is not long enough. Up to 2 years is more realistic to provide the ability for the psychiatrists and through medication often to stabilize those folks, get them in a good place, and then have them released back into society in a group home setting or at least with family supports to ensure they do well, set them up for success. But I think that is very, very necessary, because what we're doing now is leaving them on the streets to be exploited and abused. And the final thing I'll say quickly, because I want to make sure Sonia has an opportunity to jump in, is just on the addiction side. How we deal with those that are struggling with addictions is appalling. First of all, we haven't got the proper supports and services. We've said it should be free, and we need to make sure that people are getting the help when they need it immediately. And if we have to pay for private spaces to provide that surge capacity for those that need help, we'll pay for it. But the key is, I want to make sure people get that care and attention when they need it.
Sonia, you have publicly criticized BC United and Kevin Falcon for politicizing this issue. What do you mean, and how is politicization different than a disagreement on policy?
So when the BC Liberals were in power under former Minister Terry Lake, it was declared the crisis, the drug poisoning crisis, was declared a health emergency. And what I'd like to see is for us to put the kind of resources and care into that as we would any other health emergency. When 6 or 7 people die every single day from a toxic drug supply in BC, we have to really ask ourselves, have we responded to this appropriately? We agree that we haven't. I think where we might disagree is what is an appropriate response. When the health officers, and I was part of the health committee last summer, the health officers across the province, the experts, even the Abbotsford chief of police are all saying that we need to make safe supply more accessible to people. If you want to save lives, that's the place to start. Leaving the drug supply in the hands of organized crime, which is where it exists now, is part of the reason so many people are dying. And then recognizing, the upstream services that were really lost their funding in the early 2000s, and the recognition of the bigger context again of the role that poverty is playing in this, the housing crisis is playing in this. I think we, again, have to be able to take that step back and say, we can't solve one thing at a time in an emergency. We have to really look at the whole picture.
So this is your disagreement on approach, but then I'm asking you, how has Kevin Falcon and BC United politicized the issue? Because you have said this very publicly.
Well, and to some degree, it's what Kevin said before the break, which is, as the opposition party, it's my job to oppose. And I think we have a very different view of the role that the different parties can play. We operate from the place of, we're going to put solutions on the table. You pick them up and use them, great. That's fantastic, because that gets us to a place where we're all doing a better job of serving British Columbians. And I think, again, recognizing all of us agree that we have to address this emergency, that 7 people dying every day is unacceptable. But if we spend all our time trying to point out, the ways that other parties are wrong or failing, and don't spend our time on what are the solutions, the evidence-based solutions on the table that could actually get us to a different place. And that's what the health committee did. It's really disappointing to see the recommendations from that committee largely being left unheeded.
Kevin, very recently, Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry and BC's Chief Coroner Lisa Lapointe talked about perhaps the government having a larger role in regulating and distributing safe supply of clean street drugs in a similar way that cannabis is now sold. Is that something that could happen under BC United or under your premiership?
Look, I was a health minister that undertook the Salome and Naomi trials that were under clinical supervision to see whether providing hydromorphine as a replacement for those that were struggling with heroin addiction primarily at that time could get to a place where they stabilize so that we can get them into treatment and recovery. Mm-hmm. But I have to tell you honestly, I know people that have lost their lives from drug overdoses. And I think it's important to understand that I really believe the government has lost the plot here. And it's all about providing publicly supplied addictive drugs to folks in the hopes that just keeping people breathing is somehow a measure of success. So
are you saying that Dr. Henry and Lisa Lapointe have lost the plot in making this suggestion?
Yes,
okay.
I am. And I say that respectfully because the outcomes, we're not getting improved outcomes. And I think this is very important to understand. The number one cause of death among youth and under 18 in British Columbia is now overdoses. Mm-hmm. That is not a good thing. The fact of the matter is we are seeing, and I speak to doctors that are addiction specialists that tell me they are horrified at what they're seeing happening because they are seeing diversion of hydromorphone into the high schools and the colleges because the people that are struggling with addictions, even though hydromorphone, for your benefit of your listeners out there, is 4 to 5 times more powerful than heroin, but it's not strong enough for those that are struggling with addiction that want the fentanyl. So they're selling those pills so that they can get the drug of choice, but those drugs are ending up back in other people's hands. And I'm very concerned about that.
Really quickly, you agree with Dr. Henry and Lisa Lapointe?
I just want to point out in the coroner's report that came out last week that the deaths of youth in this province are attributed to the illicit toxic supply.
Right.
And it's really important to recognize that supply is in the hands of organized crime. And that's where those young people are getting the drugs that are killing them. Mm-hmm. And so we have to have a really honest conversation about the reality here. Of course, we want to get to the same place of people not using drugs that harm and kill them. And the way that we get there is recognizing the role that trauma plays, the role that lack of access to mental health plays, the role that lack of access to community and connection plays. You and I talked with Gabor Mate about this.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's really important that we not dehumanize people who use drugs in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think we can all agree that we definitely want more action on this file. We have a lot more to discuss, though, after the break. Folks, it's one thing for these two opposition leaders to sit together and to chat with me, but it's a whole other thing for them to work together on actual policy. So is there an opportunity for that? We'll find out up next. Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. We've been chatting with new best friends, BC Greens leader Sonia Furstenau and BC United leader Kevin Falcon. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for sticking around, you two.
Of course.
Sonia, I want to start with you. Let's do a hypothetical. 2024, let's say the election happens and there's a situation where no party has a majority of seats and suddenly you hold the balance of power. I'm not going to ask you which party you go with, but what I'm going to ask you is when Kevin Falcon and David Eby start to make their pitches to you about why you should join them in a minority government, do you have any conditions that you would absolutely need met before you got into a confidence and supply agreement with either party?
First of all, I always find it so funny that it would never be considered that they would just talk to each other. But anyways, peacemaker here. I think for me right now, the conversation that we need to be having and holding is we had an election in 2020 with 50% voter turnout. We are seeing a declining engagement and interest in democracy. Mm-hmm. And as elected representatives, that is one of the pieces that we have to hold up and hold together. So how do we both ensure the well-being of democracy and that government is serving the well-being of
So you want
people?
pro-rep back on the table. This is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Kevin, this was a great conversation. I'm just curious, aside from maybe making the carbon tax more equitable with some sort of revenue neutrality, are there any policy spheres where you have overlap with Sonia Furstenau and the BC Greens.
Yeah, well, I would think that we agree on healthcare for sure, because we both talk about outcomes. I think that's really important. This government's really great about announcements, but really bad on outcomes and results. Sending people down to the United States to have to get their cancer care is actually a real failure of policy that we haven't seen since the last time they were in power in the 1990s. And I think we also agree on the importance of climate change. We may differ on some of how we get there for sure, but I was always proud to be part of the government that brought in North America's first revenue neutral carbon tax. And I'm really, really proud of that. I was also proud to stand in support of Site C. I mean, that is renewable energy. 98% of our energy in this province is now renewable. No, and that's okay. And the NDP opposed it too. But
I'm just asking where the commonalities would be.
Well, but here, but I was going to say the NDP opposed it too. But here we now decide we really need it, and they're out asking for more power now when they said we wouldn't need it. Mm-hmm. And I'm really proud of the independent power projects we did, largely with First Nations, over 90% of them. That was wind, solar, and run-of-the-river power, which we are going to need in this growing province with more electrification of vehicles, et cetera. So I just think it's how we get there. We may differ on the margins, but I think there's a lot we agree on.
So yes or no, really quickly, one word answer. There is a possibility in some universe where you two actually work together in a minority government situation.
Look, I'm all about working together.
I said
together.
One word answer,
Yeah,
Sonia.
no, well, yes. I mean, yeah, Kevin says yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's really important that the people of BC can expect us to work together regardless.
Yeah.
That's what we were elected to do.
I appreciate that. Both of you, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Sonia, too.
Thank you.
Folks, what a show. We've been pushing the envelope all season with what's possible when it comes to this talk medium in BC. And it really is thanks to guests who come onto the show to have a conversation, even if it gets a little uncomfortable. So major gratitude to our featured guest tonight for doing just that. BC Greens leader Sonia Furstenau and BC United leader Kevin Falcon. We will be back next week for our season finale. For now, though, this is VANCOLOUR and I'm Mo Amir telling you that in a province where you can be anything, be colorful. Peace.